I shift focus to news coming from the war front, but this again is coming from the United States. The White House has now stated that it estimates that Russia has suffered more than 100,000 casualties, including over 20,000 soldiers killed in action as Ukraine rebuffed a heavy assault by Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, especially Bakhmut, in the last few months. These new figures suggest the Russian losses have dramatically accelerated in recent months, while Russia is struggling to encircle the city of Bakhmut in the face of Ukrainian defense. White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby has said that nearly half of those killed since December are Wagner forces, many of them convicts who were released from prison to join Russia's fight. Kirby has highlighted that the Wagner forces were thrown into combat and without sufficient combat or combat training, combat leadership, or even a sense of organizational command and control. Kirby has declined to say how many Ukrainian troops have been killed or wounded in this fighting. Also, US General Mark Milley has said in November that Ukrainian casualties were probably also about 100,000. In the meantime, let me also play out what the National Security spokesperson John Kirby had to say.
For Russia, this attempted effort, particularly in Bakhmut, has come at a terribly, terribly high cost. Russia has exhausted its military stockpiles and its armed forces. And since December alone, and remember now, some of the shelling and fighting over Bakhmut goes well back before December, but just since December, we estimate that Russia has suffered more than 100,000 casualties, including over 20,000 killed in action, nearly half of whom were Wagner soldiers, the majority of whom were Russian convicts that were thrown into combat in Bakhmut without sufficient combat combat training, combat leadership, or any sense of organizational command and control.
All right, let me also bring in former U.S. intelligence officer and American writer Glenn Carl, who's joining me live from the United States. Many thanks to you, Mr. Carl, for joining in. Now, as per U.S. intel estimates, Russia's attempt at an offensive in the Donbass, largely through Bakhmut, has failed. What does it mean for Russia's winter offensive and the declining artillery as is being reported?
All the experts from the UK, from NATO, from the United States, journalists who follow this, concur that the offensive by the Russians has caused a lot of casualties, but has not seized almost any territory and has now largely petered out, although intense fighting, of course, continues every day. The thing, 100,000 casualties is terrible in one battle area, the Bakhmut area, of course, but Russia does have 143 million population, and half of those casualties are predominantly from the Wagner private army, really, and many of them are prisoners. Many of the other casualties are from the non-Russian parts of Russia, from Siberia and so on. So the Russian population in and around Moscow and St. Petersburg has been largely insulated from this, and the Russians seem able to continue for a long time.
After Russian troops retreated from Kiev and were pushed out of southern Kherson and away from eastern Kharkiv, Bakhmut became a focus of the Russian military. Does that mean that the fight for Bakhmut has now become largely symbolic than strategic, if it is to be believed that Russia is on the back foot?
Yeah, well, it's a dangerous task to try to see into the strategic plans and mind of Vladimir Putin. The NATO, Ukraine, the United States have for well over a year from before the invasion offered a number of rational ways for Russia to declare success and to end the conflict, and Putin doesn't reason in the same way. So Bakhmut seems to have become, as you say, this symbolic objective. One could surmise that if the Russians succeeded in seizing Bakhmut, they could then say that they had conquered most of Donbass and had achieved their objectives in protecting Russia. and then move towards perhaps seeking some negotiation. But that's a rational assessment, and perhaps this is just a testosterone-laden test of wills. And I'm not being facetious. I don't know if it is as rational as I just said a moment ago.
All right, Mr. Carl, I'm going to request you to continue staying with me. In the meantime, I'd like to play the other half of what John Kirby had to say. In fact, he's gone on to reiterate how the Ukrainian army, led by the Western Front, has been able to successfully thwart Russia's attempts to annex more regions. And when we say that, they mean territorially. Because remember, Putin had already announced those annexations, but have they been able to happen on the ground level or not? Let's also listen in to what John Kirby had to say. In the meantime, I'll in fact quickly be also going back to Mr. Glenn Carl.
Russia's attempt at an offensive in the Donbass, largely through Bakhmut, has failed. Last December, Russia initiated broad operations across multiple lines of effort, including towards Volodar, Advika, Bakhmut, and Kreminna. Most of these efforts have stalled and failed. Russia has been unable to seize any real strategically significant territory. The only area where Russia has made some incremental gains, and I want to focus on the word incremental, is in Bakhmut. And that really holds, as we've said before, very little strategic value for Russia. The capture of Bakhmut would absolutely not alter the course of the war in Russia's favor. And Ukraine's defenses in the areas surrounding Bakhmut still remain strong. The bottom line is that Russia's attempted offensive has backfired. After months of fighting and extraordinary losses, Russia continues to be focused on a single Ukrainian city with limited strategic value. Ukraine's armed forces are defending their territory bravely and effectively and making Russia expend enormous resources for marginal gains. The world and battlefield momentum remain on Ukraine's side, and we will continue to support Ukraine, as the president has said, for as long as it takes.
All right, Mr. Carl, you heard what John Kirby has to say. It's rather ironic that the only incremental move coming from Russia has been the offensive so far. Having said that, it's also being talked about now that Putin has never lost in war before, neither in Chechnya nor in Georgia, not even in Syria. Will Ukraine be any different?
Well, Ukraine's a lot different because it's much larger, and NATO and the United States, being one and the same essentially, are deeply involved. So the equation is much, much different than a large Russian bear attacking a country of 2 million people, or I forget what the population of Georgia is, or Azerbaijan or Armenia are, but very, very small without any real Western support. This time it is different. But what Admiral Kirby didn't add, I think, is, and I think everything he said is accurate from what we can tell, but what he didn't add is what seems to be part of Putin's calculation, which is that by simply continuing the war, the essential unity that is required for Ukraine of NATO and European allies could fray, and pressure could build on Ukraine to seek less than the total withdrawal of Russian soldiers. And that's not that's a rational calculation on the part of Putin. We don't know how it will play out, but that seems to be the strategy he's pursuing.
All right, Mr. Carl, Ukraine was bombarded with the mightiest air raids in months. That too, just days after Chinese President Xi Jinping and Zelensky had a phone call, their first ever since the war began. Is China's role, or is China's new role now as a peacemaker, going to change much in terms of the reality of the war?
Well, I certainly would not characterize China's role as that of a peacemaker. That is what China is trying to position itself to have everyone say and perceive. And they would play the role of a peacemaker if it could be on terms that are at least somewhat favorable to Russia. But China's role is to appear as a peacemaker and to pursue its ends in its strategic competition with the United States. Russia is a useful ally, so it does not want to see Putin humiliated or replaced by someone who would be much more difficult to work with or less subservient almost to China. And he doesn't want to see the United States triumph. That's China's game rather than being a peacemaker.
Right, and that is China's game. And on that note, before I end, does Beijing's stance actually matter for Moscow, and why so?
Oh, critically. Without China, and frankly without India, Russia would have probably lost now. But India's economic support and China's economic and diplomatic alliance are critical to Russia's war aims and activities in Ukraine.